The moment your main character becomes so overpowered that nothing can threaten them anymore is the moment your story breaks. A few weeks ago, we talked about protagonist agency and making sure your characters drive their own stories instead of just being dragged along by the plot. But then you probably went back to your manuscript and realized something. If your main character has all this agency, how are you supposed to create impossible odds that actually feel impossible? It's the storyteller's paradox. You want your protagonist to be powerful enough to affect their story, but powerless enough that we're not sure they'll survive it. You want them to have choices, but you also want those choices to matter because failure is genuinely possible. So how do you make that happen in your own novel? If you're new here, my name is Brianna and I post videos every Sunday that help you become a better writer. I also make easy to use writing workbooks that help you build and outline your novel from start to finish, so if you're interested, check them out in my Etsy shop, Planner Palette Co., linked in the description below, and don't forget to like the video and subscribe to my channel. Here's what happens when you get the balance between power and weakness wrong. You end up with either a protagonist who is so powerful that nothing feels threatening anymore, or a protagonist who's so powerless that we fail to understand why the story is following them. If your protagonist can solve every problem with their magic sword, where's the tension? But if your protagonist can't solve any problems because the evil overlord is just too powerful, then why are we watching them fail over and over again with no gradual path to success? Overwhelming obstacles shouldn't strip your protagonist of agency. Instead, they should force your protagonist to use their agency in increasingly creative, desperate, or morally complex ways. These obstacles should seem or feel impossible to the reader, but you as the writer need to sprinkle in the means in which your characters are able to beat those odds. Now, the key thing to remember here is that power is not just about power scaling. In gaming terms, if the villain is level 10, you might think that the hero needs to be at least a level 8, or else they'll get crushed. But stories don't necessarily need to work that way, and oftentimes it's more satisfying when they don't. Character agency isn't about having enough power to win, it's about having enough choice to try. For example, in the first Hunger Games book, Katniss has almost no power compared to the Capitol. She can't overthrow the government, she can't save all the tributes, she can't even guarantee her own survival, but she still has agency because she gets to choose how she responds to impossible circumstances. She can choose to play the game by the Capitol's rules, or she can choose to subvert those rules. She can choose to form alliances or go at it alone. She can choose to be a killer or try to find another way. The Capitol can force her into the arena, but they can't force her to become the person they want her to become. She can't save Rue, but she chooses to bury her and give the three-finger salute that triggers a ripple effect across the districts. That's the difference between powerlessness and lack of agency. So now that you have a basic understanding of these differences, let's talk about 5 narrative techniques you can try in your own novel that still give readers the feeling of impossible odds, but that your characters can still fight against. The first technique is to give your characters impossible choices, not impossible situations. Instead of putting your protagonist in a situation where they can't do anything, put them in a situation where they can't do everything. Let's say your protagonist needs to save both their hometown and their family, but the antagonist has made it impossible to save both. That's not a situation where your protagonist lacks agency. That's a situation where their agency is being tested. They have to choose which one to prioritize, and that choice will define who they are. Or maybe your protagonist can defeat the monster, but only by using a power that will corrupt them. They can save everyone else, but they might lose themselves in the process. These situations might feel like powerlessness, but it's actually agency under pressure. Because the impossible part is that there's no perfect action they can take, not that they can't act at all. So some ways that you can create impossible choices would be to force your protagonist to choose between 2 things they value equally, make the right choice requiring sacrificing something essential to who they are, present options where success in one area guarantees failure in another, and create time constraints that make perfect solutions impossible. The second technique would be to let your protagonist affect the how, even if they can't control the what. Sometimes your plot requires certain things to happen. Maybe your protagonist has to lose their mentor, or they have to be betrayed by an ally, or they have to fail at their first major attempt. So the question becomes not whether these things happen, but how your protagonist responds to them happening. For example, let's say your story requires your protagonist to be captured by the antagonist. You could have them get ambushed while they're sleeping and dragged away unconscious, or you could have them choose to surrender in exchange for their friend's safety. Both scenarios result in the same plot point, the captured protagonist, but the second one preserves their agency. That's not to say though that having them captured while sleeping is wrong, but the second option is a good example if you want to reinforce your protagonist's characters and values through the choices they make. Unless your protagonist is careless or forgetful, then the first option might actually work better. The point is that when your protagonist has some say in how the disasters unfold, they maintain their role as the driver of the story even when they're losing. So some ways you can give your protagonist agency in moments of defeat would be to let them choose the terms of their surrender, have them turn a loss into an unexpected strategic advantage. So maybe when the protagonist is captured, he helps another prisoner who then becomes a great ally. Or you can allow them to save something even when they can't save everything, or give them the chance to maintain their principles even in failure. The third technique is to give your protagonist small agency within big systems. This is probably the most important technique, and it's one that can easily be missed. When your protagonist is fighting against truly massive forces, corrupt governments, natural disasters, cosmic entities, societal systems, you can't give them the power to single-handedly defeat those forces, but you can give them the power to affect their small corner of that larger system. Think about Schindler's List. Oskar Schindler can't stop the Holocaust. He can't defeat Nazi Germany. He can't save every Jewish person in Europe, but he can save the people in his factory. His agency operates under the constraints of an overwhelming system, but it still operates. Or The Handmaid's Tale. Offred cannot overthrow Gilead. She can't rescue all the handmaids, but she can make small choices that preserve her identity, protect individual people, and maintain hope for the future. The key is understanding that agency can scale. Your protagonist doesn't need to have cosmic power in order to have cosmic significance. So some ways that you can create small agency in big systems would be to focus on what your protagonist can protect rather than what they can destroy. Let them influence individuals even when they can't change institutions. Give them expertise or knowledge that matters in specific situations, and allow them to preserve something valuable even if they can't preserve everything. The fourth technique is the Pyrrhic Victory strategy. I'm pretty sure I'm pronouncing that correctly, but if I'm not, let me know. Sometimes the most powerful way to give your protagonist agency against impossible odds is to let them win, but at a cost that makes you question whether winning was worth it. That's called the Pyrrhic Victory, where the victory comes at such an excessively devastating cost that it almost isn't worth winning because so much is lost to achieve it. This is different from a simple loss because your protagonists still achieved their goal. They just had to pay a price that changes everything. Now this devastating price can either be paid externally, internally, or both. Maybe your protagonist saves the world, but they lose their humanity in the process by destroying several cities. Maybe they defeat the villain, but they absorb some of that evil and end up isolated from everyone they love. Maybe they get revenge, but they realize that revenge has turned them into someone they don't recognize. In this case, the questions become, what is your protagonist willing to do or sacrifice in order to beat these impossible odds? And whether they can win and still be the person they want to be. So some examples of Pyrrhic victories would be to achieve the goal but lose significant relationships, gaining power but losing moral authority, saving others but damaging themselves, or winning the battle by turning into their enemy. And the fifth and last technique is to give your protagonist an evolving challenge. This one is a bit more complex, but it can be so satisfying when your protagonist finally overcomes it, and is to make the nature of the impossible odds change as your character grows stronger. Early in the story, the challenge might be physical. She's not strong enough to fight this intelligent monster, so she trains, she learns, she grows stronger. Now she can fight the monster, but she finds out that fighting it requires her to commit the ruthless act of taking out its kids and the small village it lives in. And doing so will threaten her relationships with the people who disagree with that choice. I'm just gonna pause and apologize if you can hear my son singing really loudly downstairs. He's officially dropped his naps, so I don't get my allotted time to film anymore. But we move on. We'll figure it out. So the challenge evolves. It's no longer about physical strength, it's about ethics and maintaining her humanity while doing what needs to be done. So now let's say she solves that problem by finding allies who can help her relocate the monsters instead of unaliving them. But now the challenge evolves when she realizes that her allies are actually scientists who intend to brutally experiment on the monster and its kids to learn more about their intelligent capabilities. Each time your protagonist overcomes one seemingly impossible situation, the nature of impossibility shifts to something else. They're always powerful enough to engage with their current challenge, but never so powerful that the challenges stop being challenging. So some ways that you can evolve your challenges would be to start with external obstacles, then shift to internal ones. Begin with individual stakes and then expand to community stakes. Transform physical challenges into moral ones, or shift from survival problems to identity problems. When impossible odds are working properly, your protagonist might be able to overcome them, but they can't overcome them without changing. And that change, for better or worse, is what the story is really about. Look at Walter White in Breaking Bad. The overwhelming odds aren't just about making money or surviving cancer. They're about the fact that every choice that makes him more successful makes him less recognizable to himself and everyone else around him. Or Frodo in Lord of the Rings. The overwhelming odds aren't just about physically getting to Mount Doom. They're about whether he can carry the ring without being corrupted by it. The closer he gets to his goal, the more he risks becoming the very thing he's trying to destroy. Those questions should hover over the reader's head and become harder and harder to ignore the further they read. And that's another thing. Impossible odds only work if the readers are invested in your protagonist's success. And readers are only invested if your protagonist is actively trying to succeed. If they're just getting knocked around by forces they can't control and they're just taking it, readers will feel hopeless right along next to them. But if your protagonist is fighting, planning, struggling, making hard choices, or forcing the story forward even when they're losing, readers will stay engaged. It's a fine line to walk. Cross too far one way and your protagonist becomes overpowered. Nothing feels threatening, so nothing feels meaningful. Your readers get bored. Cross too far the other way and your protagonist becomes a victim. They're just suffering without any way to affect their situation. Readers get frustrated. That sweet spot is where your protagonist has enough agency to keep fighting, but not enough power to make the fighting easy. They can affect their circumstances, but they can't control them. They can make impactful choices, but all their choices come with impactful consequences. So here's some homework for you. Look at the biggest challenge your protagonist faces in your story and then ask yourself these questions. What choices does my protagonist have in this situation? If the answer is none, you need to give them some. What can they affect even if they can't control the outcome? If they can't affect anything, you should find something, no matter how small it may seem. What will they have to sacrifice or risk to engage with this challenge? If the answer is nothing important, you should raise the stakes in some way. And how does engaging with this challenge force them to grow or change? If it doesn't, you should add in a personal element. Remember, impossible odds aren't about making your protagonist powerless. They're about making your protagonist's power insufficient to solve their problems easily. And therein lies the key word, easily. Your protagonist should always be able to try. They should have options even if all the options suck. They should be able to make choices even if all those choices cost them something they don't want to lose. Because at the end of the day, readers don't follow characters who can do anything. And they don't follow characters who can't do anything. They follow characters who can do something, but who have to figure out what that something is and whether they're willing to pay the price to do it. So tell me, what's the most impossible challenge you've given your protagonist, and how are you making sure that they still have agency within it? Let me know in the comments below. Thank you for watching. If you like this video, you might want to watch this one next. And if you want to go deeper into your character's development, I've got workbooks specifically designed to help you build protagonists with agency. The link to my Etsy shop is in the description below. Until the next chapter.